It's Nick from Vegans Be the Change, and I'm hoping that this is all working. Sorry, I thought I had a few technical problems there. Hi, it's Nick from Vegans Be the Change. I'm just here today on Thursday, the 11th of April, to give a few reflections on what's happened in Australia this week. It's been quite an extraordinary week, and actually, probably since I've been really looking at and monitoring events in the vegan world, this is the most dramatic and extraordinary thing that has unfolded that I've seen. Earlier in the week, there were some coordinated protests in Melbourne, Brisbane and Hobart, and various slaughterhouses. The Flinders Street station was shut down in Melbourne, brought massive public disruption. And the protesters obviously were trying to bring the vegan message across. There was a huge backlash, people moaning that the taxpayers are going to foot the bill and so on and so forth. And protesters stormed various abattoirs and chained themselves to equipment. The Prime Minister came out and said he'd support farmers in test cases against the protesters, and he would introduce laws to make this much more difficult and put these people in jail. So there was massive disruption, and I'd like to just focus a little bit on that, because of course some of the things are saying, well, people are being inconvenienced, and this is terribly bad, but of course that is the nature of peaceful protest. If you apply that same measure to all the people that marched against the Iraq War in the UK or the Arab Spring, there's so many other peaceful protests where people were inconvenienced, and that is just simply the nature of peaceful protest, and it's one of the great things of the society that we live in, that is tolerated. So it was interesting that there was a great deal of anger at that inconvenience. Of course, people were complaining that the vegans are shoving their views down people's throats. And again, I mean, I read that in the press coverage a lot. And again, you know, I just think this is all standard procedure for protesting. People are inconvenienced and traffic's shut down. That's the nature of protest. And the other thing, people are saying, stop inconveniencing people. And one of the interesting things about this, of course, is by and large the people that are being inconvenienced are meat eaters, so in the purest vegan world, these people are oppressors, and I think probably it really made people stop and think and actually confront an issue they hadn't actually considered at all, and so that's, you know, that's quite an interesting paradox in all of this. But I think there's a lot of double standards at issue here. And one of the things that the vegan message, it's very uncomfortable for people to confront. And wherever, regardless of where people stand on veganism, this protest was just like any other. And any disproportionate opposition that people feel is because in many ways meat eaters are being protested against. And there is a level of, I think, a real level of cognitive dissonance at play here. But the main motivation for these protests was to do with the fact that it was the 1-year anniversary of a documentary film called Dominion, which came out a year ago. And the directors, they played everything by the book. They brought it out, they put their press releases out, they did everything the proper way, and took part in some peaceful protests and so on, and told the police in advance about it. And the net result was they got almost no publicity in the mainstream for it whatsoever, none at all, or next to none. Must be enormously frustrating if you're producing something as a brilliant documentary. It's very hard-hitting, and they used drones and secret cameras, and they got them into slaughterhouses, and I mean, it really was a piece of detective work in getting footage out that the meat industry wouldn't have wanted, or the dairy industry simply wouldn't have wanted to be seen. And it must be very frustrating to do something like that and really struggle to get publicity. And I think if the mainstream media isn't going to show any interest in that kind of activity and that kind of documentary when it's produced, then it does make this kind of inconvenient mass civil disruption almost inevitable. And it's been interesting, and I think on that level it has been a spectacular success. And it was reported that 55,000 people have watched the documentary Dominion in the 48 hours since the protest. I myself watched it. I found it really difficult to watch. And just in the last 3 or 4 hours, there's been at least another 2,000 views on the YouTube version of that film. So on that level, it really has succeeded. I like to just focus on the inconvenience. And as I said, this is the inevitable consequence if you're not going to pay attention to documentaries like this when they're produced. So the average person being confronted by these protests will ask, well, what on earth do these activists want? What do we want? We want animal liberation. When do we want it? We want it now. That would be the slogan. So what does that actually mean? And unless you're the average person, you've been reading books, you've been reading pamphlets, probably wouldn't have any idea what animal liberation would be, or humane treatment of animals, actually know what that means. Now, the activists here will be saying, well, what do we want? We actually want people to stop consuming animal products, to go fundamentally to go vegan. I mean, it's a fairly straightforward argument. And as a matter of ethics, when you consider the ethical issues, it's a fairly reasonable demand. I mean, the activists will say that the consumption of animal products, it fuels an industry that by its nature is cruel and exploitative, and in the process kills many tens of billions of animals annually. And that just the mere pleasure of the taste of something in one's gut as one eats it can't possibly justify support for an industry like that. Especially nowadays, when you consider how much good and nutritious vegan food there is. And it's becoming ever more abundant, certainly in the first world. And it's going ever more nutritious and delicious. But it's not just the activists that are making these arguments. There was a recent survey that I came across from a group of ethicists, get that word out right, ethicists, which suggested that the majority of professional ethicists, I'm really struggling with that word, the professionals who consider ethics, they really believe, a majority of them believe that consuming meat was immoral. I found that very interesting. Having said that, there are some, you can put arguments against the activists. And the main one, of course, that people say is, well, you're just one person among millions, and what you do can't possibly make a difference. That you can't, a single farm can confine hundreds of thousands of animals, and the market's just absolutely vast, and therefore what you do isn't going to make any difference. And this, in the ethics literature, is called causal impotence. Now, it's something that I fundamentally totally disagree with, and I think that people really do have a power to make a difference, that by making a stand, taking a stand on what you think is correct and right really does make a difference. And ultimately, consumer demand will change if enough people make this demand by their own habits. And one of the great phrases, I think, in this world is this is activism through the stomach, and that this, people every day eat food, and that the choices we as individuals make every day about the food that we eat must inevitably make a change in the way agriculture takes place, because it has to. Because if there is no more consumer demand for milk and for beefsteaks, then things have got to change. I really do powerfully believe that. I know not everybody agrees with me, but I do think it's very real. Now, one awkward argument that I've read that the activists would have to consider is that, well, if consumers can cause animals to die, then perhaps the consumers can cause animals to come into existence. And they'll say, well, these farmed animals wouldn't exist at all in the first place if they weren't born and bred to be eaten. And that maybe on that basis, farmed animals should be grateful to the consumers of animal products. It's a meaty philosophical question. But I personally think it's fairly obvious that you can wrong someone by bringing them into the world. And if children are born into the world purely to be kept in miserable conditions for their organs to be harvested for medical transplants, I think that would be, if you brought a child into existence for that purpose, I think that would be wrong. Um, so, are there any other arguments that can rebut the activist position? Um, I personally think that the activists are fundamentally correct. I don't think there's any way really to morally justify routine consumption of animal products, given that it's both harmful, and it's proven more and more that it's harmful, and unnecessary. So on that basis, there's a very logical argument to go vegan. But of course, veganism is one thing, but vegan activism is quite another. And a lot of vegans find that the activism a bit objectionable. Invading farmers' property, occupying restaurants, blocking traffics, and so on and so forth. Um, but of course, the fact is that some of the greatest heroes of our age have all been lawbreakers. Susan B. Anthony, one of the leaders of the suffragette movement, Rosa Parks, civil rights movement, Mahatma Gandhi. These are all people who've embraced illegal activism. It's a time-honored tradition. And some philosophers have even argued that, it's not only acceptable, but it's morally obligatory to violate the law in the case of severe injustice. And so if one takes the view that animal agriculture is indeed a massive systematic injustice on millions and millions of animals, as many argue, then vegan activists can reasonably claim to be part of a long, long tradition of morally justifiable civil disobedience. So as I said at the beginning of this little piece, it's very disappointing if people can't get publicity through the normal channels. They have to resort to this kind of direct action. And as I said, 55,000 people have viewed this documentary in the last 48 hours. And as I said, it's had a couple of thousand views in just in the last few hours. So that would be a spectacular success. And there was a huge amount of publicity in the mainstream media, particularly in Australia. And I think what the director of the film, I saw him interviewed, and he was making the point that that much of what's happening in farms and slaughterhouses across Australia, it's standard industry practice, and therefore it's legal, and it's happening every single day, and it's completely unknown to most consumers. Most people simply don't know or understand what's going on. The majority of pigs are killed in gas chambers, and apparently it's totally legal. But it's dressed up in this phrase of being humane slaughter. It would take about 2 minutes to watch this documentary to begin to question what this industry says is humane. The farmers' representatives would say, well, we live in a free country, people have the choice, and they gave the impression they're very happy to discuss what goes on, and they have leading world practices in agriculture, and they only accept people who adhere to these practices, and so it's disgraceful to target farmers. But leading world practices for agriculture and for humane treatment of animals, and even when I watched the film, some of the ways that the animals are treated are actually have been given the okay by the RSPCA. And you look at these conditions, they're almost like concentration camps, and think the RSPCA has actually given this an okay. It beggars belief to me. I think really what it comes down to is you see these things that you think, well, if these are the world's leading practices, if people actually knew what level of cruelty was being practiced, so that every time they bought meat, dairy, and eggs, they might actually think twice. Such as, for example, shredding all male chicks in the egg industry just simply because they aren't useful, because they can't lay eggs anymore. Killing all male calves in the dairy industry just because they can't produce milk. People deserve the right to make informed choices, and to do that they need facts. And the claim of the protesters and the makers of the film is that the industry is just hiding behind slogans like free range, ethical, human, happy meat, happy eggs. But they won't actually show us what that means. and it's all categorized in this film. Um, and I found when I watched the farmers responding to this, they say things like, well, you know, we've enjoyed animal products for centuries. We're not hiding behind words like ethical. We invest a lot in research and development. The animal welfare standards have increased, and we care about having healthy, happy animals. And we're concerned about enforcing the codes of practice. And I listened to this, and I wonder what on earth it actually means, because again, it's slogans. And the point to come back on that is, well, if this industry is so proud of these standards, that they simply need to be more transparent, and they need to say what's happening inside these gas chambers. So instead of saying and pretending that pigs just somehow gently fall asleep, when you look at the film, you see every single pig that goes into that chamber, it's screaming and thrashing around in agony trying to escape. You know, none of those pigs quite evidently wants to die. And there's plenty of alternatives to all of this. I mean, we can live happily and healthily without needing to kill animals. So why wouldn't we do that? It's difficult on the farmers. You know, they've had a difficult time. Certainly in Australia, there've been a lot of droughts and so on, and there could be some flashpoints, and there's some real pressures on them. And I can see the pressures of not really wanting to be more transparent. And the other thing that I've really noticed is some of the conversations that have gone on around in social media and the bottom of articles in newspapers that have talked about this. There's so many people have just been really, really aggressively confrontational towards the activists, and they'll just try and throw insults at them and just describe them as you know, anarchists, describe them as money-grubbing eco-fascists, and people just say, well, I just eat meat. I'm doubling my meat intake now. They make a rubbish documentary, didn't get any press, so now they've got to do these protests. And comments things like, well, it's damn hard to get a steak out of an animal without killing it first, and all those kind of things. And so much of the argument and so much of the narrative that's coming out in social media and on forums is sloganeering and not analytical thinking. And you know, at the end of the day, they'll be saying, well, how do you kill an animal humanely? Show us your humane way to kill an animal. There's the people who want to eat meat. And in many ways, it's the whole point is that I don't believe that I personally have one. I mean, I think it boils down to, if people want to torture and kill animals for purely, excuse me, that's a noise in my computer, apologize for that. That if people want to torture and kill animals for purely selfish reasons, well, that's one thing, but why lie about it and call it humane? I mean, if you're going to eat an animal, own up to the fact that you're killing them in the way that you are, and don't be a coward and hide behind obfuscation and general slogans. I think that's one of the points that comes out for me very strongly. I actually watched the documentary Dominion last week. I hadn't seen it before, and I found it to be absolutely extraordinary. I found it very troublesome. I didn't have the stomach to finish it all in one go. I hadn't seen footage like that. I have to say, you've got to take your hats off to the documentary makers. They've really done an extraordinary job in getting the cameras into abattoirs and into farms. The film starts off with pigs and the treatment of piglets, and it's just barbaric, and they're mutilated. And again, they use the phrase free range. I tended to think about the phrase free range mainly with regard to chickens and eggs. And then there was some stunning pictures of the abattoirs, and they talk about the most humane way of killing pigs, and electrical stunning and bolt gun stunning. And of course, them being killed in gas chambers. It was extraordinary. There's a whole section on egg-laying hens, commercial egg farms, and 12 million male chicks a year are killed in Australia. And they showed us an example of what free range meant. I actually naively, obviously, thought that free range chickens means a little bit like my friend who's got a couple of chickens at the bottom of his garden. They run around the garden and he gets some eggs and he has them. He eats them with his wife quite regularly. And these are chickens that live a nice life. I thought that's what free range meant, but not in these big farms. I mean, one of the first things that struck me is just how vast these farms are. How a handful of years ago there were a lot more farms. Now it's just a few massive mega conglomerations, and they produce a lot more food, and it's very industrialized. Um, the whole section on chickens, which are bred for meat. They grow up in their own feces. This is where the RSPCA approval stamp came in. And I really, and you see them in tiny crates on their way to the slaughterhouse. And I just couldn't help thinking of concentration camps when I saw that. There's a whole section on turkeys and how they were artificially inseminated, section on ducks and how their growth is accelerated. Excuse me for that noise, I'm sorry. And the ducks who their growth is accelerated, and they have neurological diseases, and they live for 49 days, and then they're taken to the slaughterhouse. A whole section on cows, how they're forcefully impregnated to keep the milk flowing. It's like rape, and it's continuously done. And you can see them grieving for their calves, and they're hooked up to milking machines 2 to 3 times a day, and they live on average for 4 to 8 years instead of their normal lifespan of 20. Sheep, same thing with the lifespan. And then there's sections on China, India, and rodeo, where sport is there, animals used for sport. And I looked at the many of the comments underneath articles in the newspapers, which were very vitriolic towards the activists. And then I watched the film Dominion, which is on YouTube, and I thoroughly recommend people to watch it if you've got the stomach for it. And you look at the comments underneath that, and it's just it's a different planet, you know. It's things like, I've written some of them down here. It's things like, let's get this on Netflix. These massive farms, just the point I made, look like concentration camps. This is so horrible. I'm only 10 minutes into this video, but these are already the worst images I've ever seen. Everybody should see this. Here's another one. I'm so sorry for my ignorance. Happy to announce there's another new vegan born here. Here's another one. I had no idea this level of abuse or method of slaughter was so prevalent in my own backyard. It's another one. I'm so sorry. I had no idea how much pain these animals were going through. No more meat or dairy products for me. I'm going vegan from now on. Another quote. Can we please screen this at school so they learn what's going on out there? Another person described it as a life-changing film, respect for the animals. Another comment. After watching this documentary, I feel like such scum. I'm so sorry. I've turned a blind eye for long enough. It's time to start looking at vegan options. Oh my God, I'm horrified after watching this. I'm speechless. I'm not eating meat ever again. I'm so sorry for being a human, those poor animals. This is, there was so much heartfelt outpouring of reaction on the comments beneath the video. I found that video extraordinary. I was deeply touched by it, and it's a brilliant documentary. It provoked the massive outpouring of activism in Australia. It's made veganism front and center stage of all debate on news night shows and everything. It's polarized opinion. And I think that there's no doubt that, and the Prime Minister came out and was very aggressive and against the activists. But I do think that this is a pivotal moment in Australia. Australia has, amazingly enough, in Google Trends, it's the country that per head of capita has the most Google searches on terms like vegan and vegan related things of anywhere else in the world. So there's something going on there in terms of vegan consciousness that's ahead of other countries. And this is a pivotal moment in the country's consciousness about these issues and about farming. And if there is a proper engagement and civil discourse rather than just slanging from one side to the other, then there's a real chance of moving forward in a way that can be for everyone's benefit in the long run. So these are just some of my thoughts and reflections that came out of these events. They've been truly extraordinary, and I think I get the sense that we're actually watching history being made at the moment. So I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. I do thoroughly recommend you go onto YouTube and watch the documentary Dominion. And if you have any comments about this podcast, please put them below in the comment section. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much. Bye. That's assuming I know how to end this. Yep. Thanks. Bye.